everyone. Welcome back to Dan's Astrology. Today, I'm going to be doing a video about the solar eclipse in the sign of Aquarius. This is coming up on the 17th of February, about a week from now. You may notice that here at Dan's Astrology, we do things a little differently compared to the other astrology channels, right? Now, before I get into that, I'll approach this one with some of the low-hanging fruit, okay? The low-hanging fruit, as I see it, with this astrology around the solar eclipse in Aquarius, is that if you look at the time when the president, Donald Trump, first came into power, there was a solar eclipse in Leo that year. And I have to admit, first of all, that I was just listening to some other astrologers talk about this, so it's not very original. So I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I would just like to get that out of the way, first of all, that Leo and Aquarius are opposite signs, and this is basically like the 180 where you have the North Node now technically the North Node's in Pisces, but it's close enough. The eclipse is happening in the third decan of Aquarius. You've got the North Node nearby enough to make a solar eclipse, and this is also in a square to Uranus in Taurus. The last video I did was about Venus and Mercury squaring Uranus and Taurus from this position, and basically the whole point is that to segue here into what there are a lot of other astrology channels out there. You may get the impression from watching my astrology channel that you might just be watching some eccentric weirdo, some freak, some person who doesn't know how to do things the way that normal astrologers do. Well, let me tell you, I'll give you a little rundown about why this is the case. That time when Donald Trump had his election and they had the solar eclipse in Leo, that solar eclipse was visible from where I live, and I went out and I watched it. And leading up to that, I have to admit that I went through a phase where instead of being very involved in politics, I chose to develop a meditation practice, develop a spiritual practice, and basically unplug myself from the stressful world of politics and all this kind of stuff, and focus more about cultivating inner peace, equanimity, overcoming some mental health challenges that I had. And when that MAGA era first started becoming, I was at the very beginning, I was inclined just to not pay much attention to it or not make a big deal out of it. But it was like I went from this position of being very apolitical, not involved in that kind of thing, being very focused on cultivating inner peace and spiritual practice, but the whole drama of all that got its hooks in me and dragged me out of a fairly peaceful, state of equanimity into just being angry, upset, pissed off at the state of the world. And it was in that moment, right, that I figured, man, you know what? If all I'm doing is just reacting to all this stuff in America that I don't have much, it's not even my country, first of all. And I can just thank my lucky stars that I'm a Canadian, and that at least, I'm not saying we don't have problems, but it's at least a little bit better than that. You know what I'm saying? There's, in that moment of just I spent all this time cultivating a spiritual practice, being apolitical, trying to have my own equanimity, and now look at me, I'm just fussed with all this bullshit. It occurred to me in a moment of inspiration, why don't I learn astrology just to give myself something else to do, something else to pay attention to, something else to so I can invest my time and energy into something that isn't getting angry and political, and that helps me. I found a great astrology teacher named Adam Ellenboss, who I really liked, because I was developing a spiritual practice working with a meditation teacher, and that meditation teacher, her whole thing, she would often talk about, like, if you're centered in the self, the source of creative energy and equanimity and all this good stuff. And then when you get triggered into this emotional reactivity, whether it's about politics or whether it's about family drama or whatever it is, it could be an any number of things that pulls you out from your center of inner peace, right? And the idea is that the astrology teacher that I found to work with, I thought it was very complementary to the spiritual practice, right? Because he's approached it that if you look at what's happening in your astrology chart, you have all these planets that are grabbers, right? That you're centered in your inner peace, and these planets act as gravitational forces that try to pull you out from your stable, cool, calm center of equanimity and pull you into some kind of dramatic situation. And that it helps to have a spiritual practice, I find. It helps to have a meditation practice so that you can see those forces for what they are and say, no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to get grabbed by this one and pulled out by it, basically, right? And so that was the basic thing that inspired me in the first place to become an astrologer, to give myself something to do, even if it's just, some people use the word distraction, right? Like, I'm not doing what I need to do in life because I'm just too distracted. But you could say that I deliberately chose a distraction as a distraction that would be helpful, as opposed for a distraction that would just, I would just burn up in a fit of rage or something like that, right? A distraction that could distract me in a way that would have a beneficial effect, rather than being triggered in a way that would have a not so beneficial effect, if you see what I'm saying, right? So with that in mind, it's interesting for me to consider that this all happened around the time when there was solar eclipses, a solar eclipse in Leo, a lunar eclipse in Aquarius, and now the eclipse cycle has a rhythm to it, right? Where it's 9 years since that I first started learning astrology. I chose astrology as a practice, something to put my time and energy in, to distract me, to give me something to do, so I wasn't so consumed by being upset about politics and all this kind of stuff, right? Now that we've kind of come to this 180-degree point, there is the low-hanging fruit is that, maybe if that was an entry point for Trump into the political arena, that this could be a moment where this is the curtain call. This could be the exit moment for Trump out of the political arena. But as I'm saying that, I have to also contemplate, is this time for me to take a break, to take a hiatus, to stop making YouTube videos? I would at least like to thank my fans, anyways, for giving me words of encouragement to keep going, because I have to admit, for the last few years in the post-COVID era, when I've been making these videos, I've often felt like I've been dealing with this question: would it be better for me just not to do this? If my original plan was to give myself a helpful distraction, to not get all riled up about politics, find a practice that will help me identify what could be pulling me out of my center of my inner peace and all this kind of stuff. Has it just sort of worn out to the point where it's not really helpful in that way, especially if this is the way I'm doing it, making videos like this, okay? This is on my mind, right? But as it is, look, I'm hitting the record button. I'm recording. I'm making some videos. I'm doing it, right? I'm still making the videos. But there is this interesting dynamic where it's like the 180 degree of the circle from when I first started being an astrologer and when Donald Trump first started being a politician, basically, right? And with this in mind, I would like to shift focus a little bit to another project of mine, right? Because I've got all sorts of things I could work on. I'm a multifaceted person. I'm not just a mono man who just does one thing. I do all sorts of stuff, right? The other day I was writing a substack about one of my favorite movies, Lost Highway by David Lynch. Now, this movie has an important significance because I tend to watch it during times when things are kind of intense, or I don't know, I just had the urge to watch it. What can I say? And one of the things about this, when it comes to, you think about Aquarius, I'm going to relate this to Aquarius as a sign, because when I watched this movie, I'll put a link to what I wrote on Substack in the description. But one of the things that I was noticing, like, it's one of these things where classic movies you can watch over and over and again, and every time you watch it, you see something new in it. Lost Highway is definitely one of these movies. When I watched Lost Highway recently, it was like watching the movie, not for the first time, but like it was a completely different experience watching the movie. I was relating to it in a totally different way than last time I watched it, right? And part of this has to do with the fact that I will just like you have to understand, first of all, that I'm approaching middle age. I might look young, but I'm going to be turning 40 soon. And my current living situation is living with my mother, living with my sister. And I don't know if like other families are able to like sit down and watch David Lynch, but my family certainly isn't able to, right? And what's interesting about this to me is that like a few years ago, for my Christmas list, I wanted specifically to the Twin Peaks missing pieces, because I've been a huge David Lynch fan ever since I was in high school. I got into Twin Peaks, a friend of mine lent me some DVDs. I ended up buying some DVDs or whatever, but it was like, for the longest time, Twin Peaks was always really awkward, because you would have when you bought the DVD box set, for some reason they didn't include the pilot episode, but then the pilot episode is like the first introduction to the story. And then, so if you just watch it, you're starting on episode 2, and then there's also all these deleted scenes from or whatever that are included. So I basically wanted that. So my mother bought me that for Christmas, and then she was like, "Oh, maybe we can all as a family watch Twin Peaks." And I'm like, "Are you sure? Because you do know there's some heavy shit in the subject." And then they were like, "Okay, we won't." Right? You watch your movie, I'll watch my show. We'll each have TVs set up in our own rooms. We went through this phase with my family of like trying to watch TV shows together, and I have to just sort of like grit my teeth and bear it, because I am kind of like, what can I say? I'm opinionated. I'm critical. I have things to say. There's things I don't like them. And there's a certain kind of like cultural attitude that seems to have taken over, where it's like, let people enjoy things, right? If somebody wants to just enjoy a TV show and not think too much about it, and they don't want to have your like snobby older brother, sneering and making like like, can we just enjoy the TV show for God's sake? So this kind of led me to eventually my family was watching all these TV shows that I just like lost my patience with and stopped watching TV with my family, all this kind of stuff. And there's some kind of thing where we basically learn to respect that we have different taste, right? My mother is really into, British murder mysteries, detective fiction, stuff like that, which is a lot of stuff that has to do with some pretty violent crimes, but it's more from the detective solving the mystery, solving the puzzle, rather than being a lot of violence and stuff like that, right? Now, what's interesting about, like, let's say David Lynch, is that there's actually not a lot of, like, there's very little actual scenes of violence in Lost Highway. There's one thing where they hint at some like violence, but it's just like a flash of like, oh my, like this dude's covered in blood, what happened? And you don't, it's kind of vague, right? There's not really much, but like my mother is like, well, God, Dan, if you're going to watch Lost Highway, can you keep the volume down? Like, is there going to be lots of screaming? Is there going to be lots of like horror, lots of terrible things happening? Can you just turn it down? So it creates this situation where I'm watching Lost Highway, and it's interesting because I can tell that the sound designers in this movie intentionally play with this volume changes so that they have the whole intro sequence of the movie dealing with this character Fred Madison. Whenever he's talking to his wife or they're talking to detectives, they're like barely whispering, right? And it's like really quiet, and it's like the kind of thing where it's like I'm trying to watch this movie, and I have my TV room, and I have the kitchen, and it's like my mother, I can hear my mother putzing around and breathing heavily and like putting dishes. It's like more than I can actually hear the people in the movie, right? And it's sort of like, so I'd have to crank up the volume really loud to hear the sound over top of my mother. I also have to say that a while back I set up a TV in my bedroom as a way around this. So if I wanted to just watch a TV in my bedroom rather than having it in this open space where you have to compete with noises from the kitchen or whatever. And so what's really funny about this is that it just sort of like timed up so that like while my mother was putzing around in the kitchen, there's all this like, it's really hard to hear what's going on in the movie. And then by the time my mother goes over to where she has her TV set up and then sits down, it goes to the scene where Fred Madison is playing the saxophone at the jazz club. And then when you get to the scene where Fred Madison is playing the saxophone, the volume is just ratcheted up really loud. It's just like this attack of, you know what I'm saying? Like the really like loud bebop. And so it's this kind of thing. And then my mom's like, oh my God, Dan, turn that shit down. It's like the funniest thing is that it's like, it starts to feel like the movie is not really so much about the characters in the movie as like these are characters you're supposed to, pay attention to and care about and pay attention to the plot. It's actually more about the structure of the situation and how this movie plays off the structure that we're all in, right? Where it's like, in order to watch this movie without this whole dynamic of my mom, I'm going to have to, I've already decided, like I've made some, in order to avoid spending too much time getting stressed out about what's happening on the internet, I have started making some changes in the way I decorate, but the way I've organizing my house. And one of those things is that I have a large collection of vinyl records. I decided to set that up in my bedroom so that all my vinyl records weren't going to waste and I could like hang out in my bedroom and listen to records and stuff. And that the whole thing about this is I feel like we're moving away from, instead of having shared common spaces where people congregate and do the same thing, everybody has to like have their own room where they listen to their own music, watches their own TV, and everybody is just like, that's my taste, that's your taste, you like this, I like that, we don't talk about it. And there's kind of frustrating because there's it kind of feels like even though there's a sort of like, we have this really atomized, individualized kind of structure. There's a certain kind of like disavowal of how this, even if we're supposedly, you watch your movie, I watch my movie, you're going to be putzing around making all this noise in the kitchen when it's too quiet, and then when you go sit down and settle in, then the loud saxophone is going to kick in and piss you off. And it's like there's something about this where it's like what McLuhan was saying about not just the medium is the message, but the medium is the massage, right? Like we're in this weird situation that we call normal everyday life, and the real power of art as a medium is to massage those dynamics, right? Where you're kind of like, you might see that you're like, oh, my son's trying to watch a movie, but I'm making all this noise and pissing him off and he can't listen. And then when I sit in my chair over here, then I'm getting blasted by the fucking saxophone attack, right? And my rationale of why I don't want to watch that is because I don't I don't like violence, okay? I don't like, but then she spends all her time watching all the stuff that's all about violence. Meanwhile, what happens in my show? Some fucking saxophone solos, right? But the saxophone solos are just too much, right? You can't handle that, can't handle those saxophone solos, am I right? And there's something about this, which is like, they're kind of like each of these things, and then whatever the hell my sister's watching, probably like the Heated Rivalry show, they're all kind of like, if you want to go Deleuze Guattarian about it, like they all click together and make a machine where each person is like, I have my taste, I like what I like, you like what you like, and we're not going to argue about it. But nonetheless, this machine is working off each other, and whether you want it to or not, right? And the other thing which is interesting is that I notice like sometimes, if I'm listening, like I still use YouTube sometime for streaming, and like sometimes I might be in the mood for listening to some like loud rock and roll music, and it's like sometimes when I do that, I get like the algorithm gives me recommendations like, I'm just a sensitive neurodivergent mom who needs peace and quiet. I'm like, you know what? I'm listening to music on headphones privately, and whether I don't know if there is like somebody in my algorithm feed who doesn't like fucking loud rock and roll music, but you know what? I am having a private experience where I'm enjoying the music that I like, and you're some neurodivergent person who doesn't like the same fucking loud rock and roll bands. You're welcome to listen to whatever music you want to. Whether I'm listening to loud rock and roll in my headphones shouldn't why the hell is the algorithm being all like turn down the music, please? Like, I'm listening to fucking headphones. What the fuck is this, right? Like, it doesn't make any sense. It's fucking batty. You know what I'm trying to say? And these are the things that are coming up for me with the solar eclipse in Aquarius, right? Where it's kind of like there's also this kind of thing. You also have to keep in mind, to bring in the astrology, that we have Mars and Pluto in Aquarius, making it pretty volatile and pretty intense. But it's all to do, when I think about Aquarius, regardless of where Aquarius in your chart is, it's saying something about structure, I think, right? It's saying something about the structure of whether it's your neighborhood, whether it's your house, whether it's your politics, whether it's your health, your body, whether it's your diet, whether it's your, supply chain. All these things are structural issues, right? And one of the things that has come up for me recently around this stuff is that a lot of people obviously, this is the whole thing about how post-structuralism gets a bad rap, right? But I spent a few years taking classes online with the Weird Studies guys. I'm taking a break right now, but I do think that the Weird Study guys are on a higher level of content creation than a lot of the other stuff on the internet, if you want to call it that. Anyways, but the Weird Studies guys, like J.F. Martel, puts it very simply, that like you can have structuralism and post-structuralism the same way that you can have like foreground and background, or like a tree and not a tree, right? Like just because there is, you can look at the post-structuralism of things doesn't mean that there isn't a I'll give you a more concrete example of this. One of the things that I've mentioned before is that I like Ken Wilber's Integral Psychology, Spiral Dynamics. There's a guy who is also, back when I was taking the Weird Studies courses, it was before they had the Weirdosphere. They had Jeremy Johnson, I think his name is, and the Neural Learning platform. And Jeremy is always doing these like Gebser courses. And I don't know if I know enough about Gebser to really speak authoritatively, but I've noticed Jeremy keeps posting these things on Facebook whenever I check Facebook about it's like you can do a more post-structural version of what Ken Wilber is doing, basically, right? But the thing about this is that I I tend to actually disagree with this, because there's this basic idea that you've got these different spiral dynamics levels, where if you think about like, you have red, blue, orange, green, right? With purple being even below red or whatever, right? But there's something about that people often take issue with this approach, because it gives you a structure where there are stages that happen in a specific sequential order, as a implicit hierarchy that one thing develops after the other, and that there's a lot of people who don't like that. And rather than, like, personally, this isn't about, like, whatever, being, whether you are fond of the idea or not fond of the idea. I'm just saying that as I perceive things, the way that I think about things, it tends to reaffirm that structure rather than reaffirming that it's all just some like ooey gooey post-structural goo, right? But this is, Alan Watts had something about this, where he talked about prickles and goo, right? That there are some people who relate to things in a prickly way, and people who relate to things in a gooey way, right? And structuralism, post-structuralism is just prickles and goo, basically, is all I'm saying. And the thing about this is that I think we don't want to throw post-structuralism out entirely, or how I'm relating to the what's going on with this solar eclipse in Aquarius, right? The way that Aquarius, you could talk about a metaphysical structure, the hierarchy of angels and higher dimensions or something. You could talk about the governmental structure. How do we structure our politics? How do we structure our institutions? You could talk about the structure of science, right? Like, how do we structure our knowledge or whatever? How do we structure our, all these structures without having access to being able to consider post-structuralism, and it's all structure without post-structure. It starts to, that whole thing about being like a rat in a maze, where you're just a rat in a maze trying to look for a piece of cheese, right? And it's like, there's something about it where, like, we feel powerless, like we're just stuck in some, or like, it's also, this is very mythical. It also reminds me of the Icarus and Daedalus and stuff like this, that Daedalus constructed the labyrinth, but he wanted his son to escape, so he gave his son a way to escape it with the wings, but then, the kid flies too high to the sun, melts the wing, and comes crashing down, right? But Daedalus is the idea of, like, being caught in the labyrinth and not having, the question is that, are we just going to live our lives trapped in the labyrinth, or are we brave enough to attempt an escape route, or is that just going to be like the flight of Icarus? Or do we have the ability to not just passively accept the structure as it is, but be able to participate in making changes to that structure, right? And I think that this is the part of the problem of what we're seeing with the current state of affairs with America and politics and all this kind of stuff, is that the structure of American politics set up by the founding fathers is itself under attack. Like, the basic, all the checks, and they put in all these checks and checks and balances to prevent tyranny, dictatorship, to protect the freedom and democracy of the American project. And now that very structure is under attack, basically, right? And as a Canadian, I'm at least a little bit more comfortable, because we have a sort of degree of being removed from this. But on the other side, because Canada is such a we're a large country geographically, but we're a small country in terms of population and in terms of trade. There's, for those who are unaware, California is a little bit bigger of population than Canada, right? So that if I don't know what I'm trying to say. There's something about all this where whether we like it or not, we're all citizens of planet Earth. Even if you don't like globalism, there is some way. There's going to be some level where even if you want to just like go all cottage core and go all hyper local, you're never going to be completely exempt or protected from things that are happening at a global level, right? And so and I think oftentimes you have to watch out for this sort of like the disavowal of globalism, because I think it's like sometimes what seems to you like what it seems to be sometimes being really local and hyper local could actually be a participating in globalism, right? There's certain things going on that I'm just going to throw out there based on what I'm seeing already. The one that I also have to say that I've decided to be careful about not doxing myself, but the thing is, I don't know. There are things happening in my neighborhood, my local community, that are perhaps worth mentioning if you consider the themes of what I'm saying about this eclipse cycle, right? About the structure and all this kind of stuff. I live in a farming and fishing area, and one of the things that happened recently was that there was a accident, supposedly, where the Westham Island Bridge was damaged. Now, in the whole time I've been alive, this has never happened before. People driving tugboats have been a very good job of not crashing the fuck into the bridge and taking it out. But just so happens that here in 2026, we have some crazy tugboat driver fell asleep at the wheel and decided to crash his tugboat into the bridge, right? Now, the Westham Island is a major agricultural resource for our community, providing us with food. And it's just sort of, it's kind of maybe a bit interesting to consider that, like, during a time where there's all these talks of heated trade wars and economic warfare and all this kind of stuff, we have the bridge taken out, which is going to be a huge expense to repair this bridge. And the farmers are getting their products to the people using barges now, right? Which the barges are really expensive. And there's some kind of thing where it's like, there's some kind of thing where people are like, whether you want to be political or whether you want to be spiritual or whatever, right? Now, the thing is, some people who may not be very political may feel that if there's a spiritual connection where knowing where your food comes from, like as in going back down to your roots, right? Going back down to the good old, like, yeah, we know these farmers, we know they're good people, we buy their potatoes from them. When we want to get a pig, we don't just buy a piece of frozen bacon at the supermarket. We'll buy the whole hog. We'll buy the whole hog. Put it on a spit roast and have a little community hoedown with our neighbors, like these old country values, right? And what's interesting is it seems that, like, is this just an accident, or is there a direct attack on the local grassroots? Regardless whether you're political, you're going to need to eat some food, right? Regardless whether you want to make it into a political issue, you're going to have to. You want to be what? You want to get your food from your own community? You want to support your own local farmers, or do you want to be dependent on a global empire who is going to punish you by jacking up the prices on global exports that you're dependent on? And if you do things that they don't like, they're going to tariff you to fuck with you, right? It seems to me, I'm just paranoid perhaps, but it seems to me that our own resiliency is under direct attack. Okay. And it's like this is what I'm saying, is that it's not just for Aquarius. It's like the very structure, like the structures of the institutions are under attack. The fucking bridges are under attack. The roads, the bridges, the institutions are protections of scientific knowledge, are access to higher learning. All this stuff is under attack, and you can see this in the astrology with Mars and Pluto in Aquarius during this solar eclipse. And it's not, I mean, it is what it is. One of the advantages of astrology is that we can see that, once Mars moves out from Aquarius, it's going to be traveling through Pisces, it's going to be traveling through Aries, it's going to be traveling through Taurus. And as it hits these signs, we're going to see that Mars energy activating different things. So we can at least predict that during this phase, there may be a lot of attacks on the structures that we rely on to give us a stable, predictable, trustworthy society. It could feel a lot like, things are falling apart during this one, right? And then once we get Mars into Pisces, then we may have a bit of relief from that, because the Mars will be playing out in a way that is more on the emotional or to do with social relations and stuff like this, right? And then what I'm concerned about, perhaps, is when we get Mars in Aries, because then we're having Mars, the war sign, in its own sign, and we may see some direct, open conflicts. But there is also Saturn and Neptune there, so it may be like there's one foot on the gas, one foot on the brakes, and a certain, a frustration around the inability to deal with martial stuff in the most direct martial way possible once it gets into, kind of getting ahead of myself here, but this is what I'm saying. It's like this particular moment is colored by Mars and Pluto in here. Mars will be moving out of the sign at least later on, but Pluto is going to be here for a long while, and Pluto is often a signifier for corruption. So if you're in it for the long haul, we're going to be dealing with a lot of issues around structural corruption for a good long while Pluto's in Aquarius. And then, if you're paying attention to all the other astrology, once we get Uranus and Gemini in a trine, things are going to be pretty interesting. I think things are going to be moving pretty fast once we get that one happening. So this is my delineation for our upcoming solar eclipse in Aquarius. Thank you for watching. I hope you like my sunglasses. I was inspired by a meme about about somebody who's, I don't know if you guys know the astrology meme about the structures are collapsing and all this. But that was part of the inspiration. Anyways, thanks for watching. Tune in for next time. As it goes, I'm sticking it out, and I'm going to be making more content. Please like and subscribe. Tell your friends and family. Spread the word. Dan's Astrology is here to stay. Keep on rocking in the free world. Do-do-do-do-do. Do-do.